Our gospel reading for this morning comes to us from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Let me invite you to listen for God's word to us today. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It was a few years ago that the mother of one of our son's friends called our house early in the morning in a bit of a panic. It was 7 a.m. It was her first day back to work after being on maternity leave. At the time, she had an 8-week-old baby and a second grader. "Do you mind if I stop by your house this morning?" she asked in a rush. Of course we don't mind. What's going on?" Well, in her scramble to get out the door, she did not notice that her older son, the second grader, had managed to leave the house without his shoes on. She drove him halfway to school before she figured out that her child was just wearing socks. No time to return home, so they swung by our house. We looked for a pair of our second graders' shoes to see if they would fit. None of them fit. So we looked for shoes that our older son used to wear to see if any of those would work. We found a pair. They fit okay. I should say they worked for that day because they had to work, but they did not fit exactly right. And I thought to myself, it's hard to wear somebody else's shoes. I don't just mean that literally, of course. I mean it in the other sense of that phrase. It's hard. Have you ever tried it? Have you ever tried to put yourself in someone else's shoes before? It can be a challenging thing to try to see the world the way that another person sees the world. Just think for a moment about our national election this past week. Have you ever tried to walk around in the shoes of a person who voted opposite from you? When you do that, do you do it with curiosity? Like, I wonder where that person is coming from. Or do you think to yourself, where in the world is that person coming from? It can be a challenge, right? Have you considered at any time during this pandemic, have you considered what the experience of the pandemic has been like for somebody who is, say, 20, 30 years older than you? Have you considered what it's like for someone who's 20 or 30 years younger than you? Do you see what I mean? To see the world the way that another person sees the world, it can be a challenge to put on somebody else's shoes. But this morning, I'd like to ask you to do just that. I'd like to ask you to walk around in the shoes of the woman in our text, the widow in our text. According to Mark, there was a day when Jesus was watching people put money in the treasury. Many rich people put in lots of money, and a poor widow put in 2 copper coins worth a penny. Jesus says of her, she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Can you imagine what it's like to walk in this woman's shoes? She put in everything she had. Why did she do it? When I invite you to put on her shoes, what I'm really asking you to consider is what it's like to make a commitment. That's an appropriate thing to do on Commitment Sunday, right? This Sunday when we make a promise, a pledge to our church. What is it like to make a commitment? Because that's what that widow did with her 2 coins. She made a huge commitment. And sometimes making a commitment, not just with money, but with anything, it can make a person a bit nervous. I recall what happened the week before I asked my wife to marry me. I had met Heather's folks. I really liked them, and I thought they felt pretty good about me. But I also knew that Heather was their only daughter, and I knew that I needed to share my plans with her folks ahead of time. I knew I needed to talk with her father. So I made the phone call. But before I made the phone call, I recall practicing what I was going to say ahead of time. Over and over in front of a mirror, I was saying, I'm going to ask Heather to marry me, and I'm calling to ask for your blessing. I'm going to ask Heather to marry me, and I'm calling to ask for your blessing. Well, I got my courage up. I made the call. Heather's father answered. We talked for 5 or 10 minutes. I hung up, and I thought, well, that went well. I was calm, I was cool, I was collected. Now, Heather's father also remembers that conversation. Calm, cool, and collected. Not the words that he uses to describe how he recalls it. It's more like, I'm going to ask Heather to marry me, and I'm calling to ask for your blessing. And I suppose he is right. I was a little nervous that day. But if we're talking about the widow in our text for today, I don't get the feeling that she was nervous when she made that commitment. I don't feel like I'm walking in the shoes of an anxious person or a person who's only giving because they'll feel guilty if they don't give. I feel like, when I picture being in her shoes, I feel like I'm in the shoes of a grateful person, a person who knows what she has been given in this life, a person who knows how thankful she is for the gift of life. May I suggest that that's why you and I make our commitments today as well, because of our gratitude to God for the gift of life, we make a commitment. Because we are created in the image of a generous God, we make our generous commitment. Because we want others to experience the joy and gratitude that God intends for them, we make our commitment. In his best-selling book, Being Mortal, Dr. Atul Gawande tells the story of a nursing home that went through some unusual changes. Back in the early 1990s, a young doctor named Bill Thomas had just taken a new job as medical director of Chase Memorial Nursing Home in upstate New York. There were 80 residents in this facility, and all of them faced a myriad of problems: physical disabilities, Alzheimer's, other forms of dementia. As one might imagine, it was a depressing place, particularly to a 31-year-old doctor who had never worked in a nursing home before. Dr. Thomas tried to fix the despair he saw by using his familiar bag of tricks: ordering scans, altering medications. Maybe this will improve the residents' lives, but it was all to no avail. So what did he do? Did Dr. Thomas give up on the nursing home and go find a more rewarding way to practice medicine? No. He doubled down on his commitment to that place. In fact, he came up with a different diagnosis for what was ailing the residents. As Gawande puts it in his book, Dr. Thomas came to think that the missing ingredient in this nursing home was life itself. And he decided to try an experiment to inject some life. What did Dr. Thomas order? He decided that the facility needed more living things: plants, animals, children. he approached his boss. He asked his boss for 2 dogs, even though the state regulations allowed for only 1. "All right, I'll put it down," said his boss. "I'm really not into this as much as you are, but I'll put 2 dogs down." Dr. Thomas said, "Now what about cats?" "Well, what about cats? We've got 2 dogs down on paper." Dr. Thomas replied, "Some people are not dog lovers. They like cats." "You want dogs and cats? Let's just put it down for discussion." "Okay, I'll put a cat down." No, said Dr. Thomas. "We're 2 floors. How about 2 cats on both floors?" "We want to propose to the health department 2 dogs and 4 cats? And one more thing," said Dr. Thomas. "What about birds?" "No birds allowed in nursing homes." "But what about birds?" "Well, how many birds are you talking about?" "Let's say 100. 100 birds in this place?" Long story short, Dr. Thomas convinced not only his boss, but the state of New York to grant exceptions to their rules. And before anyone knew it, the nursing home staff brought their kids to work with them after their kids got out of school, and a garden was planted in the back of the facility, and a playground for kids was installed, and then the animals arrived. Not one animal at a time, the animals arrived all at once. It was total pandemonium, Dr. Thomas remembered. There were parakeet feathers flying everywhere. The staff was busy chasing the birds to try to get them back in their cages. And what were the residents doing? They were laughing their behinds off, Dr. Thomas said. But over time, the residents also did something else. People who we had believed were not able to speak started speaking, Dr. Thomas said. People who had been completely withdrawn and non-ambulatory started coming to the nurses' station and saying, "I'll take the dog for a walk." Over time, the statistics came in as well. Medication use going down. The death rate going down. Chase Memorial Nursing Home was no longer the depressing place that it used to be. All the parakeets were adopted and named by the residents, Gawande writes. But even more importantly, the lights turned back on in people's eyes. Do you see what can happen when someone makes a commitment? That's why I'm so proud to serve this congregation. Westminster has a rich history of making commitments that literally give other people life, whether it's people who are temporarily without a home, or folks who are struggling for food, or children at Thornwell who need a stable place to live. Your commitments, your pledges go a long, long way toward providing life, toward bringing the light back on in people's eyes. When I imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of the widow in our text, you see, I'm not picturing a down-in-the-dumps person. I picture a woman with a spring in her step and a light in her eye. She knew she was a grateful person because she knew she was God's person. When Jesus says of her, she has put in everything she had, all she had to live on, the Greek here actually reads her whole life. She put in her whole life. That's what it means at the deepest level when we make our pledge to this church. We don't pledge just to make the budget. We don't even pledge simply because others in our community need our gifts, although that is very true. We pledge because we need to do it. We are saying to God when we make this commitment, I belong to you. We are saying to God, everything I have, it comes from you. The late, great preacher Fred Craddock tells the story of the time that he was a pastor of a small church in a little town in Oklahoma. At one time, there were 4 churches in this town: a Methodist church, a Baptist church, a Nazarene church, and a Christian church. Each church had its share of the population on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. Attendance rose and fell, but the best and most consistent attendance in the town was at the little cafe, where all the pickup trucks were parked and all the men were inside, discussing the weather and the cattle and wheat bugs and hail and wind. And all the while, their wives and sons and daughters were in one of those 4 churches. So, the churches had good attendance and poor attendance, but that cafe had consistently good attendance. Better attendance than some of those churches, in fact. The men were always there. Once in a while, they would lose a member at the cafe because their wives finally got to them, and so you'd see them go sheepishly off to one of the churches. But those men in the cafe always felt strong. "We're the biggest and best group in town," they would say. Now, these weren't bad people. They were good people, hardworking people. The patron saint of the group that met at the cafe was named Frank. Frank was 77, good person, pioneer, rancher, farmer. He had prospered. He had his credentials. But they always said about him, "Oh, Frank, he'll never go to church." Frank was a friendly man. He'd talk with anybody, including the preachers who he bumped into at the cafe. The talk was of politics or the weather. He would visit with them, but in every conversation, he had his saying down pat. "You know me," he would say. "I work hard. I take care of my family. I mind my own business. Everything else is fluff." It was Frank's way of saying, "Don't bother. I'm not a prospect." So one Sunday morning, one of those preachers got a big surprise. In fact, the whole church was surprised. The whole town was surprised. And the men at the cafe were absolutely dumbfounded when old Frank presented himself at one of those churches for baptism. Of course, the community got to talking. "Frank must be sick. Guess he's scared to meet his maker. Went and got baptized. Never thought he'd do that, but I guess when you get scared." Well, the next day, Frank was back at the cafe talking with Dr. Craddock. "Frank, do you remember that saying you used to give me so much? I work hard, I take care of my family, I mind my own business. Do you remember that?" "Yeah, I remember that." "You still say that?" Yeah, I still say that." "Then what's the difference?" "The difference," said Frank, "the difference is that back then, I did not truly know what my business was." Now, I was going to ask you to put yourself in Frank's shoes for just a moment. When Frank gets invited by his new church to make a pledge, to make a commitment, do you think Frank went back home and said, "I'll just put this down"? Or do you think he looked at all that he had, all that he had been given, and he made another commitment, a generous pledge because of all that God had given him? I was going to ask you that question, but the truth is, I don't want you to put on Frank's shoes right now. I want you to put on your own shoes, the shoes of someone who knows deep in her heart that she has been claimed and called as a precious child of God, the shoes of someone who knows the marvelous gift of life that God has given him. I want you to put on those shoes right now. And before you come to our pledge through here at the church this afternoon, or before you mail your pledge into the church this week, ask yourself, what kind of commitment most faithfully expresses the gratitude, that I have for all that God has given me. Amen.